Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to think about Pachelbel's famous canon, his canon in D. Who was Pachelbel? What's a canon? What makes this piece so famous? How does it tick? We're going to discover all. So it's often known as the canon in D because it's in the key of D major, two sharps, F sharp and C sharp. And Pachelbel's canon was originally scored for 3 violin parts and a basso continuo. That's slightly unusual to have 3 violin parts. 2 violin parts was very common in the Baroque period. 3 violin parts, slightly less usual, but fine, it works perfectly well. So we've got these 3 violins and then basso continuo. Now, what does all that mean? Well, basso sounds like something to do with the bass. Continuo sounds like the word continuous, so continuous bass. Well, we've definitely got a bass that's continuous throughout the whole piece of music. But a basso continuo is this. It's when you just have a bass line. So here is the bass line that we get in Pachelbel's canon. And it's played by a keyboard player. So in the basso continuo, the keyboard player would normally be a harpsichordist. If you were in a church doing church music, it might well be the organist instead. And the bass line was always doubled by another instrument. So if you were playing the harpsichord as the keyboard instrument, it would often be doubled by the cello playing the bass line. If you're playing the organ in the church, it might be the cello again. Might be the bassoon playing with you on the bass line. And what did the keyboard player do then? If the keyboard player only had a bass line, does the keyboard player just sit there playing bass notes all afternoon? No, a bit more to it than that, because we have something called the figured bass. In other words, instead of writing out all the notes of the harpsichord or the organ parts, you had the bass line, and the person playing the harpsichord or the organist would play the bass line with the left hand and also look at these numbers that were written underneath the notes. Those numbers are called the figured bass. So let's have a look at how figured bass might work. If we take this first note D, well, say underneath that D, you saw 2 numbers, 5, 3. Okay, so you'd have that D there, and then underneath it might say 5, 3. Well, what that means is, what's the 5th note above D? Well, the 5th note above D is A. What's the 3rd note above D in the scale of D major? F sharp. So now my 5-3 chord above D is D, F sharp, A, which is a D major chord, or chord 1, or the tonic chord, whichever you like to call it. And doesn't mean that the keyboard player just has to play those 3 notes. But it does mean the keyboard player has to come up with something that uses the notes D, F sharp and A with D as the lowest note. So I could play that chord, or this chord, or this one, or this one, or this one, or this one, or this one. I could decide how I want to organize life above it. I could change the number of parts. I could have a great big chord with lots of notes in it. Or I could just have the bass note with 2 other notes in it. So the keyboard player can make lots of decisions as long as the keyboard player is playing the notes that the figures tell us about. So instead of 5-3, say it said 6-3 above that D. Well, you'd be thinking, well, there's D in the bass, 6 above it is B, 3 above it in D major is F sharp again. Oh, that's giving us a different chord, isn't it? D, F sharp, B. And that's really a B minor chord, B, D, F sharp. But that D is at the bottom in the bass. So we say it's a first inversion chord of B minor, or a first inversion chord 6. So you can have different numbers to indicate different chords. And that's how the figured bass works. Now, there's a bit more to it than that, but not too much more to it, because that's the principle that was used in the Baroque period. Later on, we got into using these Roman numerals to indicate chords. But in the Baroque period, they had this figured bass. Now, they had lots of abbreviations, so you might see a note that's got no numbers. So what does that mean? Well, 5/3 chords come up more often than anything else. So if you see no numbers at all, you just think, oh, that's a 5/3. And they did that so we didn't get too cluttered up with numbers. And other chords are abbreviations. So if you see 7 on its own, for example, it means 7/5/3. But if you're a continuo player, you soon get to know these numbers and all their abbreviations. I must say, I've always enjoyed playing continuo. It's quite fun, you know, it's great to be able to read all the notes that are written in a score, but it's also great to think, oh, well, I've got the bass line and I've got some figures, but I can decide, well, how am I going to organize that chord? How many notes am I going to have in that chord? Is it going to be high? Is it going to be low? And you can kind of adjust to suit the piece of music or what's going on at any given point in the piece, or you can inject your own kind of musical thinking into it. So I think it's a great fun thing to do, actually. So Pachelbel's canon, 3 violin parts and the basso continuo. The canon was originally followed by another movement called a jig, and a jig is a lively dance. And so the original full title was Canon and Jig for 3 violins and basso continuo. So hopefully now that's kind of clarified what that title means. Both those movements, the canon and the jig, were written in the key of D major, those 2 sharps. So that's that. Now, what do we mean by canon? You know, because that's a funny thing. It sounds like a piece of ammunition that you fire at people, doesn't it? That's a different kind of canon. A musical canon is this. It's when you have one part that starts off being played by an instrument or sung by a voice, and then another voice or another instrument comes in with the same tune just a little bit later. So you might know a round like London's Burning. Then a second voice comes in with the same thing while the first voice carries on. And then a third voice comes in, and so it goes on. So that's a canon. The first part starts, the second part comes in a bit later, does the same tune, the first part carries on. If there's a third part to the canon, well, a bit later, that part comes in with the same tune. And it's just the same thing, just running, you know, a bar apart or 2 bars apart or something. So that's how a canon works. And in Pachelbel's canon, we've got this canon at the unison, which means at the same pitch, in 3 parts across the 3 violins. It's also got an element of something else called a chaconne. Okay, so what's a chaconne? A chaconne is when you've got a bass line that's repeating. So chaconne, let me just put that up here so you can see how to spell chaconne. Okay, lots of Baroque music uses chaconne when you've got a repeated bass line. That's what's going on in Pachelbel's canon. So this bass line just repeats over and over again, doesn't it? Okay, we'll come back to say a bit more about that later. Now, when was this piece written? Why was it written? To be honest, we're not entirely sure. But scholars are agreed that it was composed somewhere between 1680 and 1706. Well, actually, that's quite a wide span of possible years, isn't it? But there we are. We're not entirely sure that we can be more specific with that. But people who spent time studying this have come up with those boundaries somewhere between 1680 and 1706. So that puts it neatly in the middle of the Baroque period. So Baroque period 1600 to 1750. So you see where this fits in. The interesting thing about this piece, or one of the many interesting things about it, is that this piece was largely forgotten about. You know, Pachelbel died, his canon died with him, and it might never have been played again until relatively recently, in my lifetime anyway. In the late 1960s, people started to play it again. They said, hey, you know, this is a pretty good piece, isn't it, really? And so as it started to be played, it became increasingly popular, and it turned up all around the world in the original form with the 3 violins and the basso continuo, and arranged for other instruments and bands and orchestras, and all sorts of things came out of it. The bass line even started to be used in some more modern pop songs, and again, we'll come back to that later. Certainly, over the years, I've been asked to play this many times because I'm an organist, and people have asked me to play this at their weddings and at funerals, interestingly. And it's one of those pieces, isn't it, where, often a piece just sounds happy, If you're going to be at a wedding, well, you might play the wedding march. It's a jolly piece, isn't it? You wouldn't play that at a funeral, would you? Or if you're at a funeral, you might play... Well, you wouldn't play that at somebody's wedding, would you? So some pieces, they're naturally happy pieces or sad pieces, and they fit the occasion. Pachelbel's Canon's an interesting one because it sort of works in a sort of neutral place emotionally. So you can have it at somebody's wedding, or you could have it at somebody's funeral. So maybe that's part of its appeal, that you can use it any way you like. So who was Pachelbel? And apart from this canon, did he write anything else that was any good? Well, Pachelbel was born in 1653. So you see he's kind of 50 years into the Baroque period, and he lived until 1706. Now then, this is why scholars are agreed that this piece could not have been written after 1706. So we can all join them in being scholarly and saying, why couldn't it not have been written after 1706? Because he died. So that's why it couldn't have been written after that. But Pachelbel was a German composer. Now, when I say German, we have to be a little bit careful, because if you know your history of Europe, you'll know that back then Germany wasn't a big country like it is now. It was this whole set of little states that were kind of loosely connected. But Germany as we know it today, if you like. He was a German composer. He was an organist, so I've always felt I've got something in common with him. He was a teacher, so I've got that in common with him as well. And he came from Nuremberg. You might know Nuremberg for more recent history, the Nuremberg trials, for example. But that's where he came from. And Pachelbel wrote a lot of sacred music and a lot of secular music. What's the difference? Sacred music is music for the church. So that's organ music, music that the choir sings in the church service. And secular music is basically everything else. So music in the theatre or music that's done at a concert somewhere, that's secular music. So just in case you're not clear about sacred and secular, that's what that's about. Well, being an organist, it's no big surprise that Pachelbel wrote quite a lot of music for the organ, and he wrote for other keyboard instruments as well. And he loved writing music in variation forms. Now, that's not at all uncommon, particularly in the early Baroque period, where they were kind of getting to grips with writing music for instruments that wasn't just the instruments doubling up with voices. And they thought, well, how should we do this? Well, we'll start with an idea and then we'll have a set of variations on it. We'll find different ways of kind of using the same material. So Pachelbel fits into that history of variation form writing very well. He wrote church music, he wrote chamber music, music for small groups, small ensembles of instruments. And sadly, a lot of Pachelbel's music has been lost, so we don't know what hidden gems there are that have just disappeared. But the music that survives is well worth playing. It's funny, isn't it, how some composers write a piece and you sort of think, wow, that composer's really famous for that piece. Paul Dukas, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, Actually, he wrote some other good music as well, but people don't really know it. Pachelbel, certainly famous for his canon above everything else, but he wrote some lovely music as well. I play a piece of music by Pachelbel in F minor. That's an organ piece, absolutely beautifully written piece. You can hear how expressive that is. So he's not a kind of one-hit wonder, even though he is most famous for this canon. Well, why did Pachelbel bother writing this canon? Did he just sit down on a Saturday afternoon and think, I think I'll knock up a canon? Or was there some reason for the piece being written? Because often there is. Well, some scholars think that he might have written this piece for the wedding of Bach's oldest brother. So the famous Johann Sebastian Bach had a brother called Johann Christoph Bach. So it might have been written for his wedding. Now, why would Pachelbel have written this piece for Johann Christoph Bach's wedding? Well, Johann Christoph Bach was one of Pachelbel's pupils, one of his students. So that would follow, wouldn't it, that he might ask his teacher to write a piece of music for his wedding. That's a lovely idea, isn't it? Well, other scholars have got other theories on it, so we can't really answer that question with any certainty, but that is a possibility. So let's get back to this canon. It's in 3 parts, 3 voices if you like, because you've got the 3 violin parts, and they're working this canon, you know, the same tune, one after another, and they're doing that 2 bars apart or 2 measures apart, and it's going on over this repeating bass part, and the repeating bass part is an ostinato, which is a term you I've likely come across before, but if you haven't, there it is, ostinato, just a repeating pattern that normally comes in the bass. So what's this ostinato bass line in this piece? Well, here it is. So you can see what we've got. We end up with a series of 8 notes, and each of those notes has a chord with it. So let's have a look at these 8 notes for a moment. Those are the 8 notes. Now you might notice that these 8 notes are organised in a pattern. We start with D and we fall a 4th to A. So there's a falling 4th. Then we take the first bar and we take it down a 3rd, down 3 notes. And so it goes B to F sharp. So we've got the falling 4th again. But D to A in the first bar is the same pattern in the second bar, but 3 notes lower, B to F sharp. In the third bar, we have another falling 4th that's also a 3rd lower than bar 2. So G to D. So you see the first 3 bars of these 4 bars, we've got this repeated 2-note pattern. D down a 4th to A, take those 2 notes down a 3rd, B down a 4th to F sharp, take those 2 notes down a 3rd, G down a 4th to D. And then the 4th bar is kind of finishing it off. It's going back to the G, and then it goes to A. Now, quite often you find that you have this in a lot of pop songs actually, where you go chord 4, chord 5, and it goes back to chord 1. The 4th note of the scale to the 5th note of the scale, going back to the 1st note of the scale. So you see what he's doing? He's kind of using that 4th bar, that 4th measure, as a link to take us back to the beginning of the bass, so we can keep repeating the bass line over and over again. Now, here are the chords that Pachelbel uses, and I'm using these Roman numerals to describe that. So what's all that about? You're probably very familiar with this, but if we take a scale of D major, D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D, and we form triads on each note. So we take the first note of the scale, we put 3 notes above it, 5 notes above it. That's the tonic chord or the tonic triad. We call that chord 1 in Roman numerals. This is chord 2, chord 3, chord 4, chord 5, chord 6, chord 7. So this is how it works in Pachelbel's canon. You've got chord 1, you've got chord 5, you've got chord 6, you've got chord 3, you've got chord 4, then chord 1, and then chord 4, and then chord 5. So he's using the same chord as he's using the degree of the scale. So we have the 1st degree of the scale with chord 1, the 5th degree of the scale with chord 5, the 6th degree of the scale with chord 6. You see how it goes on. He might have made other choices. I mean, chord 3, for example, is not that commonly used. It's perfectly possible, sounds perfectly good, but it's sort of in the hierarchy of chords, sort of sits in the sort of weaker end of it. He could, for example, here have used chord 1 again in what we call first inversion. He could have used the D, F sharp, A chord, because there's an F sharp in the bass there, and he could have just said, I'll have F sharp in the bass, and I'll use chord 1 in first inversion. But I think he wants to kind of keep the pattern. We talked about how the melodic nature of the bass line is this repeated pattern. So I don't think he wants to use a different chord there. So he just uses all these what we call root position chords that match up with the degree of the scale being used in the bass. So you've got this series of bass notes in the pattern we've described, and you've got a series of chords, all root position chords in the same pattern as the bass line. That kind of adds to the kind of appeal of what's going on in the bass line. It gets it very familiar. It becomes a sort of earworm very quickly indeed. Now, the 8 chords that repeat over and over again in this ostinato, these 8 chords we've just talked about, are a particular pattern that was known as the Romanesca. So, the Romanesca. And there are other Baroque composers who used the Romanesca, so this pattern of chords. So you find that a lot in the 17th century and the 18th century, where composers are using this Romanesca pattern to build a piece of music on it. So if you come across a few other Baroque pieces and you think, hang on a minute, that sounds a bit like Pachelbel's canon, it could just be that the Romanesca is being used. Okay, well, during the 1600s in Germany, in Italy, and in France, we had quite a few pieces that were built on an ostinato bass. And they were called chaconnes. We talked about chaconne earlier. But there's another word for it as well. It could be the passacaglia. It's a mouthful, isn't it? Passacaglia. Looks like passacaglia, but we say passacaglia. It's more or less the same thing. So if you come across those terms, well, we know that we're using an ostinato bass for a chaconne or a passacaglia. So pieces built over repeated patterns that were usually in the bass. They don't have to be, but they're usually in the bass. And then you have variations going on above the bass in these upper parts, in the 3 violins, in the case of Pachelbel's canon. So what happens is in Pachelbel's canon, the bass line that we've talked about already is repeated 28 times, no less. And then you sort of think, okay, well, the bass line comes 28 times, so we must have 28 variations going on above that bass line. That kind of happens, but actually Pachelbel does something a bit smarter than that, because that might be a bit predictable, mightn't it? You get 4 bars of the same bass line that's repeated 28 times, and you get 28 different versions of it in the upper 3 parts. That would be a bit tedious. So what Pachelbel really does is to write 12 variations over the bass line being repeated 28 times. So it gives us a bit of kind of welding and interlocking going on, and it gets a bit more interesting. Lots of 4-bar phrases or 4-measure phrases, but within the whole structure, he's kind of varying the way he does things. So if you kind of look through these variations, you see that he starts, we've got some quarter notes, some crotchets, then we have some 8th notes, some quavers, then we have some 16th notes, some semiquavers, then we have leaping quarter notes or crotchets, we have some rests that come in, then we have a little pattern that works on the basis of a scale, and then he says, oh, well, let's have some staccato now, and then he uses quavers or 8th notes with that, with some rests, and then he goes back to the 16th notes or the semiquavers, and he uses things like neighbor tones or what we call auxiliary notes. That's when you have a note, you go up 1, you come back again. So this might belong to the chord, you go up 1 to a note that doesn't belong to the chord, and you come back. Or you have a lower neighbor tone or a lower auxiliary note. You have a note, you go down 1, you come back. So he does that sort of decoration. He repeats these 16th note patterns after that, so the semiquaver patterns. Then he says, right, we need something different now, so let's use some dotted rhythms. And then he says, we could combine dotted rhythms with 16th notes, with those semiquavers, and combine that with these upper neighbor tones or these upper auxiliary notes. So he starts to pull a few threads together. And then he says, oh, let's have something different again. So he goes back to the rhythm and he does something that's a bit syncopated, doing some kind of offbeat stuff using quarter notes and eighth notes, crotchets and quavers. And then we have quavers or eighth notes using octave leap. So do you see what's going on? He's kind of thinking of different ways to present the melody and the rhythm as he goes through these variations. So Pachelbel's canon is then a kind of what we call a strict polyphonic form. That's a canon. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it means if it's polyphonic, it's organized in lines that are layered on top of each other. That's what the canon's doing. So the chords have to fit, if you think of it vertically, but it's really a linear construction. And because it's canon, it's very strict. So it's a strict polyphonic form. And he's using this variation form by having this kind of chaconne thing going along in the bass underneath it all. So he just kind of very skillfully combines this canon with this chaconne in the bass. So let's just have a little sort of look through then what's going on, because I want to just give you a flavour of how some of these variations work. So we talked about this bass line, we've talked about the chords, and then underneath I've just given you some kind of snippets of variations. So, you know, what's happening early on in the piece? Well, you see how this combines with the bass line. So it's note for note, just kind of coming down the scale and then going up again. It's rather nice, isn't it? The way that he finds a way just to come down the scale by step and then just creep up a bit at the end and make that fit a bass that's kind of leaping around the place a bit. So they make a kind of nice duet with each other. And then, okay, well, we can't carry on like that. So then here's a bit of variation that's using quarter notes or crotchets. That sounds very different, doesn't it? You know, when you hear that, you sort of think, has that got anything to do with this? Well, it has, isn't it? It's still spelling out the same chords, but it's a bit more mobile in the rhythm, isn't it? More things happening. And then it gets even more active in the rhythm when you get something like this. And that still fits above the same bass line and fits with the same chords. And you see these lower auxiliary notes I was talking about, or lower neighbor tones, you know, that D and this D fits with this D and this chord 1 in the bass. But the C sharp doesn't fit with that chord 1 at all. Chord 1 is D, F sharp, A. There's no C sharp in it. But that C sharp is just 1 below the note before and the note after. So it's a lower neighbor tone or a lower auxiliary note. It's a way of embellishing a melody. So this note, this note, this note all belong to that bass note and that chord, and that one is a little decoration. And you can see other things that he does, like when you come to this group of notes, we're working with B in the bass and chord 6, so that's B, D, F sharp. D is a chord tone or a harmony note. There's another D. B is a chord tone or a harmony note. But what about this C sharp? That's nothing to do with that chord, is it? B, D, F sharp, no C sharp in there. But this is what we call a passing note or a passing tone. It's passing by step between these two notes that do belong to the chord. So there are different ways you can embellish things with auxiliary notes or neighbor tones, passing notes, passing tones. And so it enables other possibilities. You can use notes that belong to the chord. You can use these things we call inessential notes. So there's a bit of that going on there where it's kind of more active in the rhythm. Then what about this one? Here's an example of one of those variation things that's kind of leaping around more. So less busy in the rhythm, but leaping in the melodic design. And it's interesting because it sort of slows down a bit at the end to match the bass, but just before that we have that quicker bit, you know. But notice leaps, that's an octave. There's a sixth there, there's another octave there, there's another sixth there. So that's in contrast to things that we were looking at earlier. So you see how we built in all these different aspects to the variation in the melodic design and in the rhythmic design, the use of chord notes or chord tones and the use of inessential notes. So lots of clever things going on. Now, the amazing thing is that, since the revival of Pachelbel's canon in the 1960s, people have not only enjoyed the piece, but they've enjoyed it so much that other people writing in very different musical styles have got hold of it and said, hey, I'd kind of quite like to do something like that. So they've kind of nicked bits of Pachelbel's canon or pinched some of the ideas or all of the ideas in the bass line, and they've kind of come up with something new in a totally different style. So, a Greek band called Aphrodite's Child, they came up with a song called Rain and Tears, based on Pachelbel's canon. A Spanish group, the Pop Tops, came up with a song called Oh Lord, Why Lord? Nothing to do with Pachelbel hundreds of years later, but everything to do with Pachelbel's canon, which is interesting. Even Kylie Minogue, I Should Be So Lucky, that hit single she produced in the late 1980s, inspired by Pachelbel's canon. The Farm used it in their single All Together Now. The Pet Shop Boys, Go West, it's in there. We've got other songs, if you're old enough to remember, The Streets of London in the mid-1970s, it's in there. Basket Case by Green Day, have they got anything to do with Pachelbel? Yes, they've kind of linked with a canon. Don't Look Back in Anger, Oasis, that's a song you might have come across. Well, there it is. It's got kind of variations in it, but it's still using the same thing. Maroon 5 even, they've got a piece called Memories that uses the thing. So many other modern hits as well. So it's amazing, isn't it, that not only Pachelbel's original pieces kind of survived, but it's also inspired other people to use it. So we said other Baroque composers used this Romanesque chord pattern that we've talked about and this idea of variations, but here it is being kind of revived as a way of doing things. So if you're a bit of a composer yourself, you might think, hey, we could be onto a good thing. Maybe you could produce the next hit single by using the Romanesque, the pattern of Pachelbel's canon, or maybe you want to experiment doing this kind of variation idea. So lots of inspirational ideas for composers to kind of rework something in a more modern style using the same ideas of Pachelbel. So lots of interesting things to go at. But I hope that's been a useful introduction to Pachelbel's famous canon. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, let me invite you to go to the Music Matters website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. Lots of things on there to help you with your own musical development. Click on courses. There are things to help you with music theory, harmony, composing, keyboard harmony, dealing with oral stuff, all sorts of stuff, analysis, you name it, we've got it there. Lots of people need this stuff and find it difficult to access, but it's all there, so have a good look. And while you're on the homepage, have a click on Maestros, because Maestros is the Music Matters international community of musicians. And if you become a maestro, there are all sorts of perks that come your way with membership. 3 levels of membership, nothing to do with ability or age or anything. Level 1 is a kind of support level. Level 2 brings you more perks and gives you access to a monthly live stream where I'll be teaching every month, and you can join the live chat, ask questions, make comments, raise other topics you'd like to be covered in the future, that kind of thing. Connect with other musicians. You might want to go as far as level 3, which embraces all the level 1 and 2 benefits. But in addition, at level 3, you get a second live stream each month. And in that live stream, you can submit your own compositions or your own theory or harmony work or a recording of your own performance. And I'll give you one-to-one feedback on it. And we'll share that in the group and we'll run a live chat as well. Everybody's amazingly supportive. Lots of wonderful people who are just happy to share with other people on the same journey, and we all learn from each other. So that might be something of interest to you as well. Anyway, have a look and see what's there that might appeal. www.mmcourses.co.uk. www.ecom.co.uk.